Kia ora koutou. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed lunch. Coming up a little bit later on this afternoon, we have sessions on digital trade, agribusiness, and US investment. But first, frontiers in space. We heard earlier today about the exciting developments in space from Rocket Lab's Peter Beck, but there is much more happening in the space industry here in New Zealand. As I said this morning, Secretary Ramindo called out the space industry as an exciting area of collaboration between our two countries. To canvass the space frontier that Kiwi companies are leading, we're about to hear two short presentations from two key players in the industry, followed by a panel discussion. Please remember to keep those questions coming through. To get things started, I would like to invite Andrew Johnson to the lectern. Andrew is the head of the Space Policy and Regulatory Systems team within the Space Agency, which sits within the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. The Space Agency was established in 2016 and is the lead government agency for space policy, regulation, strategic sector development and outreach. Andrew is an economist and policy professional with nearly 20 years' experience in both the public and private sectors here and in the UK. Please welcome Andrew.
Thanks very much, Tim, and kia ora koutou katoa to everybody this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I'm from the New Zealand Space Agency. Yes, there is such a thing. We are situated in the New Zealand Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment down in Wellington, and we basically have three key roles for the space sector in New Zealand. The first is to regulate activity happening from New Zealand. So you would have seen Peter's address before. The Electron rocket from Mahia requires licenses, both from us and actually also from the US authorities. And anything that rides on his rocket also requires a permit, so that's the regulatory role. We also have a policy role. So very quickly, as we found in space, such a dynamic and innovative field, the use of space technology and who's using it very quickly touches beyond our regulatory regime and into policy questions. We also have an active international engagement with the UN bodies and several other plurilateral fora, which means the policy function is a very active one, together with many other agencies around Wellington. And the third and possibly most exciting for this industry conference today aspect of our function is to support the development of a space sector in New Zealand, and that's primarily through the skills and innovation systems, and some of that has a specific space character, and some of it is more general. Just wait a second might have had a slight slide meltdown. No, it's going okay. So maybe first of all to touch on the breadth and size of the space sector in New Zealand, because it is surprising actually to a number of New Zealanders. A couple of years ago in 2019 we had a Deloitte analysis of the size of the sector, and it turned out relatively surprisingly large, 1.7 billion per year. And of course Rocket Lab is a big part of that, but it's by no means all of it. And in fact, there's a wide range of New Zealand companies that are involved right throughout the space supply chain, and many for several years. And some of them will be names that you've heard of, and some of them may be less familiar. So, for example, Dawn Aerospace currently has small thrusters on satellites that are in orbit or have been launched already. They're in the process of developing a space plane. This is down in Christchurch. This is a Dutch-New Zealand company, so they also have operations in the Netherlands. Space Operations New Zealand Limited, right down the bottom of the South Island, provides ground services to essentially all the major launch companies of the world. Fabrum Solutions, and also in Christchurch, and providing cryo-cooling solutions. Lanico, who you may have heard of, involved in wool filters for human spaceflight. And there's also many companies in the downstream segment, which is often where a lot of the value is for the sector, and you can see on the slide there in terms of the applications figure, taking a large share of the overall value chain. So companies like Orbica, based in Christchurch, Xera, based in Alexandra, Sequent, another one in Christchurch. So yes, I just wanted to emphasise that the New Zealand sector is actually quite vibrant and operates in another number of parts of the value chain. So perhaps moving on to talk a little bit about some of the platforms that we have for supporting growth in New Zealand, and particularly our partnerships involving US colleagues. So I guess the first one, which is probably very important, and Peter Beck had referred to it in his address earlier, is the regulatory partnership we have with the Federal Aviation Administration. So being a US company, Rocket Lab is required to hold a FAA license in order to do space launches wherever they're operating throughout the world. But the development of the New Zealand system is quite relatively unique, actually, globally, in that we're able to recognise large parts of that licence for our own licensing system. So particularly the safety critical aspects, where the FAA has a very long history regulating that activity in the United States for a number of different providers, we're able to recognise those for the safety critical aspects of our own licensing regime. And indeed, that's a critical component which allowed New Zealand to stand our system up so quickly. Closely allied to that was the negotiation of a technology safeguards agreement with the United States. And what that's enabled is the sensitive rocket technology that exists in the Electron rocket can be imported into New Zealand. Perhaps a more innovative one of recent years has been our partnership with the Silicon Valley startup Leo Labs. So this is a company that is basically involved in space situational awareness. So this is tracking objects once they've been launched in New Zealand. So we have an obligation as a launching state under the UN treaties that New Zealand is a party to basically keep track of everything that's been launched from New Zealand and know where that is. Now, we could do that in a pretty cumbersome way, downloading data off military platforms that our partners might run, probably having someone sitting behind a computer screen 24/7 and taking notes in a very laborious fashion. But what we actually did was partner with the startup company who was building a series of space radars around the world and ended up building one here in New Zealand, in Naseby in central Otago, and simultaneously developed for us what we call a regulatory dashboard, which enables us to log on pretty much from any desktop and see an interactive map of where all objects that have been launched from New Zealand currently are. So that's been a great boom for the regulatory function, but also for the partnership with an innovative company like Leo Labs, and we've gone on to do further research with them and have them partner with our university sector as well. Conscious of time, and I want to give our other speaker a chance to speak as well. But I would also note that we've also had a number of other interesting partnerships, which I'm happy to get into in the Q&A. Notably, our first space mission will be with a US NGO called the Environmental Defence Fund, looking to measure methane emissions from space using an innovative new satellite, in a partnership which also involves Rocket Lab, NIWA, and the University of Auckland. And we also have an extensive engagement with NASA, who everyone will have heard of in this room, whether it's the weather balloon campaign operating out of Wanaka again this year right now, whether it's the Sophia Flying Observatory, which will be having its swan song campaign of flights from Christchurch, we hope, later this year, or closer to what the Space Agency is involved in, the series of internships that young New Zealanders have been able to take up with NASA, physically at the Ames Research Centre prior to COVID, and more recently virtually with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is really getting young people a huge opportunity to see what it's like to work for NASA and hopefully enthused to take up a career in space in New Zealand. So there's probably many more things we could touch on. I hope we get some chance to do that in the Q&A. I just wanted to emphasise that partnerships are at the heart of our approach. We do have a very open mind to doing things a bit differently. We're a small nation, but we think we add tremendous value and look forward to working very much in the future with all our American friends. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Good insight into what you say is actually a surprisingly significant sector in New Zealand. Our next speaker is Catherine McGowan, Asia Pacific Regional Director for Wisk. In this role, Catherine is responsible for leading a multinational team focused on bringing Wisk's first electrical vertical takeoff and landing air taxi to market. Prior to joining Wisk, Catherine was a group captain in the Royal New Zealand Air Force, which I know has given her a fascinating view of the sector from a very different perspective. Please welcome Catherine McGowan.
It's all very so grand with the lights and the music. It's like I'm at the Oscars. Just wait for the music to play me off as well. Right, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you to the team for inviting me here today, and hello to all these wonderful members of the community. It's wonderful to be chatting with you about a new frontier in aviation that's a little bit closer to home than space, but we think no less special. Wisk is one of the companies building the future of urban air mobility, or advanced air mobility. This industry will use a range of technologies to provide transport options in and around cities. I know this is something that will be of interest to you all, as it's more likely that you will one day fly in an aircraft like this than that you will be personally involved in the exploration of outer space, although I'm sure you'd all make wonderful astronauts if that was your choice. Right, I'm going to start, if I can click the button. No, I can't. Okay, so I want to start with some observations. Are we able to advance the slide? No? Oh, there we go. All right, now since I've been with this industry for about 4 months now, I'll start with some observations around the key drivers behind this next evolution in aviation. Firstly, is a huge focus on sustainability. Wisk is one of many companies developing battery-powered flight and a sustainable approach to the whole life cycle of our platform. This is important to our partners, to the community, and most importantly, to our skilled staff who want to make a difference for the future. Despite the changes created by COVID, congestion remains a big consideration. Wisk's primary business proposition is around providing options for those cities where movement on land-based transport is unpredictable or inefficient. This will be a substantial global market in the future, including in the Asia-Pacific region. However, as we engage with stakeholders, it's also interesting to hear the user cases that are important to different communities. The transport systems that most of us engage with every day have evolved over many decades, preserving choices made long ago. Some planners see this industry as one of the things that will enable a future with more equitable access to healthcare, education, and employment. Finally, the emergence of this industry is not just one technology, but many, as well as electrification, vertical lift, and autonomy. There's a range of advancements in airport infrastructure, information exchange, safety, security, and others, providing options to other companies as well. I'll have the next slide, thanks. And with all that in mind, Wisk's goal is to deliver safe, everyday flight for everyone by developing an all-electric, self-flying air taxi. It's our vision that this will be an accessible form of transport that provides communities and individuals with new ways of connecting with each other. And the next slide, thanks. This is, of course, not an easy thing that we have chosen to do, and we have to make sure that we do it safely. Wisk has spent the last 10 years learning how to develop and operate self-flying electric eVTOL aircraft. We are very excited to be currently developing our Generation 6 aircraft, which will be certified for commercial operations. We'll be announcing details of this aircraft later this year, so watch this space. All right, on to the next slide, which is the interesting bit, some footage of our 5th generation aircraft flying in Tekapo in the South Island as part of the test flight program that we ran in New Zealand. You can see the aircraft taking off vertically using the lift fans. This means that it can operate from a small footprint around the size of a heliport, either at an airport or in the future on sites in the city. Once up in the air, the aircraft transitions to forward flight using a propeller. This means we can take advantage of the efficiencies of aerodynamic flight, which is very important when you are operating on batteries. Probably the most important feature of this aircraft, and one that marks a different approach from our competitors, is that it is self-flying. Using a range of existing and new technologies, the aircraft follows a preset flight path while also responding to instructions from the supervisor on the ground or from air traffic control, and reacting safely and predictably to unexpected events. It is the use of autonomy that will unlock scalability and therefore accessibility for this industry. But this is also where the biggest challenge lies. The aircraft must be certified as safe for flight, but we also need to work with regulators to develop new procedures and means of compliance so that self-flying aircraft can integrate alongside piloted aircraft inside complex airspace. This is where the value of integrating teams in the US and New Zealand is very powerful. So in the next slide, in the spirit of this event, I wanted to highlight our partnership approach in bringing this product to market. Wisk is a joint venture between Boeing and Kitty Hawk, and we also have a range of other partners, including, of course, Air New Zealand. Boeing is an investment partner, but also a strategic partner, working with us on some of the challenging parts of developing and certifying a new aircraft. Also important to other ecosystem partners for when we come to market. So, finally, with these big challenges in mind, what is the advantage of working with New Zealand and the United States? Slide, thanks. The United States has a long history and deep expertise in aircraft development and manufacture, but for Wisk, there have been some very specific advantages in combining the approaches of both locations. New Zealand was a global leader in establishing a regulatory environment which enables autonomous or drone activity to support research and development. This means we could conduct flight testing with our prototype aircraft. Wisk is now moving towards commercialisation, which is where our modestly sized but well-connected aviation ecosystem comes into its own. Being able to connect with regulators and other players in the industry will be hugely powerful to create the future of aviation. As always, people are at the heart of capability, both a workforce that is up for the challenge and a population that are as curious as we are important for developing new ways of transport. And finally, I'll finish again on a core value of the team at Wisk. The decarbonisation of transport, and especially aviation, will take everything that we can throw at it. We are committed to helping people connect in the future in a way that is kinder to the environment, and shared sustainability goals help keep us moving in the right direction. Right, that's enough from me. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Thanks, Tim.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And I might start with, because I know we're going to get a question on this, and it's the elephant in the room. Catherine, when can we fly on one of these aircraft?
Now, I know there are a lot of people who would want their own personal sign-written aircraft, and I don't blame them. Obviously, the date that we will come to market is commercially sensitive, and I'm sure this audience can appreciate it. But what I will say is that the critical path is the regulatory environment. So we think that we will have an aircraft ready to fly, but the main challenge will be working with regulators to integrate it into controlled airspace. And this is where working with New Zealand will enable us to create learnings that can be taken to the world and to FAA to advance that process.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue actually into my next question that I wanted to direct firstly to you, Andrew. It seems like New Zealand has been able to be really nimble in terms of adapting and changing regulations where needed. I wondered if you could maybe give a couple of examples of what the Space Agency has been able to do in that area, and maybe tell us how you've been able to be so nimble.
Yeah, okay. Tim, probably the best example is the standing up of the regulatory regime. So the Space Agency as an idea has only really been around since about 2015, 2016. The Act was passed in 2017 and commercial flights were happening by 2018. And that really took the space world, just completely by surprise and really put New Zealand on the map, that we were able to do that so quickly. And there's a few, I guess, key elements of that. One is the relationship with our colleagues in the United States, so being able to recognise the FAA's licences for big chunks of our licences as well. Not everything, of course. There will always be national interests, international obligation type questions that only New Zealand will be able to assess, but on the safety critical elements we were able to do that. And that also had another element as well, in that the close relationship that we formed with the FAA has enabled us to bed in some really significant capability building on the New Zealand side. So that's one key aspect, I'd say. Another aspect, I think, is because we're coming to space as a what's known as a new space actor. So rather than a monolithic government program backed by billions of dollars and decades of research, commercial new space is more characterised by frequent fast launches, Peter Beck referred to earlier today. Timescales in the months or years, amounts of money in the millions. And what it means also is that rather than launching things from a government perspective, we're also asking ourselves, what do we want to enable to be launched from a commercial perspective, and what policy problems and regulatory problems do we need to solve to allow that sort of activity to be permitted? So it's quite a different mentality, I think, from how space nations around the world typically have operated, because they've tended to be much more government dominated.
Yeah, that's great. Catherine, I wondered if you might want to add to that. I know you've already spoken a little bit about this, but obviously Wisk is headquartered in California, but you have a base here in New Zealand. How has that helped?
So similar to the experience with the space environment, it's the regulatory relationship between FAA and the CAA that's enabled us to operate our aircraft and to take some learnings into both regulatory environments. So we have actually, over the last week and this week, we're conducting some airspace integration activities down in Tekapo, which is really exciting and which is enabled by the CAA's Airspace Integration Trials Program. And we'll be sharing those learnings with the FAA in order to validate our concept of operations and move forward. So there's real practical examples of how that makes a difference.
We've got a lot of questions actually coming in on this topic, so I might jump to one of these. This first question: access to space takes a large volume of fuel. What is New Zealand's role and investment in cleaner access to space, and how much effort goes into greener propellants? Andrew, would you want to have a crack at that?
I'll try and have a go at that. I mean, the whole issue of fuels in aerospace, I think, is probably more an environmental, Ministry of Environment type concern, but nonetheless, we do take an interest in research that's going on around New Zealand, and we have supported some of the companies in our sector. I mentioned Dawn Aerospace earlier in my remarks. Down in Christchurch, it's developed a green approach to satellite propulsion. You'll be aware that Rocket Lab is interested in pursuing the development of the Electron as a recoverable vehicle. So that in turn does require some government recognition of meeting our obligations under the Technology Safeguards Agreement, and so we're very supportive of that and want to see that happen. I guess the other idea to have in mind with sustainability and space is that some of the activities that we could in New Zealand do using space-based assets in the future will actually enable much more emissions intensive activity that's currently done on Earth to be replaced by using space-based assets. So an example might be monitoring the conservation estate, where we might have to send people out into risky environments and use a lot of resources and fuel getting out to measure the state of our conservation estate. In the future, we could potentially do that via satellites, and that's going to be ultimately a more environmentally friendly way of doing that.
Yeah, really exciting. And Catherine, I guess in a similar vein, you're looking to introduce more sustainable ways to travel by air. I wonder if maybe you could talk about that in a more practical sense. So for those of us here in the room that go to take a Wisk flight, how does that work in terms of, I guess, charging the planes? How far can they travel? What could we do with them?
Perfect. So I know a lot of passengers are going to want to have a green journey in the future, and the way Wisk is looking at this is the whole life cycle. So we're looking at manufacture, disposal of materials, including batteries, when they're no longer able to be used in the aviation environment. In terms of direct emissions, the aircraft is fully electric, and in the New Zealand environment, with a grid at over 84% renewable and growing, that means we can have confidence that we're reducing the amount of carbon produced by everyday travel.
Yeah, brilliant. Might take another one of these questions here. Well, perhaps you might want to comment on this as well, but what more could New Zealand be doing from a regulatory perspective? You've got Andrew here on the panel, to encourage more US investment in this emerging industry.
Okay, so my wish list is. Right, so we work closely with regulators in New Zealand, but we appreciate that the expansion of the aerospace industry creates resourcing challenges. So in terms of aviation, we're using risk-based compliance rule set, which are really flexible but which create demand. So we realise that support to agencies like CAA and other regulators will be necessary in the future if we're going to maintain our global leadership in these types of industries.
And Andrew, a question for you. I'm just quite interested to know, how does the space agency work with other government agencies? How integrated is that?
We like to think very integrated. So we have a very regular dialogue with all of the main agencies, both the policy and regulatory sides down in Wellington, and we like to think that's a potential source of advantage compared with some other countries, larger countries perhaps, where that sort of coordination's difficult within a department, let alone across. So yeah, there's active collaboration. Of course, there's several other agencies have interests in space, whether it's our foreign ministry, defence forces, people interested in the aspects of space that can be, aspects of policy that can be monitored from space. So Ministry for the Environment, Department of Conservation. And so, yeah, we're always looking for more cooperation we can do, but there was a very much a can-do, working together attitude to stand the regulatory system up. And we're hoping we can build on that as we look to grow out the sector.
Catherine, a question for you. Obviously, the Wisk aircraft is autonomous. Can I have a show of hands in the audience, perhaps? Who would want to go and have a flight in a Wisk aircraft? Pretty much everyone. Okay, there's a question that's come through asking how much consumer education are you having to do, or will you have to do? Because, or I guess for some people that aren't in this room, autonomous flight might be considered a bit scary.
Yes, I can imagine. So social licence and working with communities is a huge part of our work stream towards commercialisation. So first and foremost is around safety. So we need to prove to people that we're safe and that the platform will take them where they need to go, and they know that if should contingencies arise. So a lot of it is around certification and working with the authorities. It's also about telling our story as we go. So we've started telling the story of our history over the past 10 years. For quite a while, Wisk was a very quiet company and didn't talk about what it was up to. But then we realised that if we were going to ask people to trust us, they had to know us. And so that's why you'll see much more active involvement from Wisk as we move towards the commercialisation. But I guess I would say that one of the areas we get challenged, and perhaps from audiences like this and in government, is people do want to know that this is going to make a difference. So it's not only about safety, but is this truly green, and how will this support the wider transport sector? So it's not just their own personal transport that people are thinking about, they're thinking about the other impacts of the system.
Great. Well, if you ever need a volunteer, I guess you've got 200 people in this room that will be happy to go on a flight. There's a couple of questions that have come in on COVID, and I guess this is a slightly different, it's a different sector for COVID. And so I wondered, I'll put the question to you, how has COVID impacted your work in space and aerospace?
So globally, I think the impact of COVID has been quite interesting for space. So there have been a number of activities that were basically not able to be conducted when COVID kind of hit. Right the way through to even monitoring economic activity. Ships coming into ports, numbers of cars in parking lots, and other measures using satellite data were used as a proxy for economic statistics during the COVID crisis because regular information gathering methods were not going to be reliable with the restrictions that were placed. In terms of the growth of the sector through 2020, 2021, there was actually continued to be very strong investment in the sector, and as Peter Beck referred to earlier, Rocket Lab itself floated on the NASDAQ last year in the middle of COVID. In fact, there were a number of other similar floats on the NASDAQ, with the US in particular being a strong point. So it does seem to be a sector that has come through relatively well through the COVID sector, through the COVID time, and we're hopeful that we can build on that as we go forward.
Yeah, brilliant. Would you have anything to add from your perspective?
So in terms of our company development, that was able to continue throughout COVID, because obviously as you're working on aircraft development and flight test programs continued. I think the outcome for us of COVID will be urban planners thinking differently about how populations want to live and move in the future, and starting to look at urban air mobility as an opportunity to not just lift people up into the airborne environment, but also enable them to connect differently now that people are putting together their professional and recreational activities differently and providing access they might not have had before.
Brilliant. We've got just over a minute left. So what I might do is just ask for something a little bit more, little bit aspirational, and ask you both, where would you like to see New Zealand in, let's say 5-10 years in your sectors?
I think probably the thing that New Zealand would like to capitalise on is the reputation we've kind of, in some ways secured by Rocket Lab deciding to launch from here. We need to build on that and continue to build the profile of New Zealand, not only as a country to do launch activity from, but a great place to grow and invest in a space business from. And so that's going to be, for New Zealand, very much a partnership-led thing. So trying to work with some of those countries that have a longer legacy in space, but are attracted to New Zealand because it might be easier to do some of the things that they might struggle with in their home countries. That would be my hope.
Yeah.
I would like to see New Zealand be one of the first, if not the first nation, to have autonomous passenger flight integrated in airspace alongside crewed passenger flight, and I think this is within our reach.
Brilliant. And I look forward to the US Business Summit of the future, where we can give away some of your flights as well.
Excellent. I'll bring a little doggy bag.
Brilliant. Can we give the panel a huge round of applause? It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much. Both of you. Thanks a lot.